Number 1. Jeffrey Wiese, Red Lake High School. It began on a cold March afternoon in 2005 on a quiet Native American reservation in Minnesota. No one expected that within minutes, a small high school in Red Lake would become the scene of one of the deadliest school tragedies in modern American history, one that would expose cracks in local policing, emergency response, and mental health intervention on tribal land. Jeffrey Wise was just 16. He lived with his grandfather, a tribal police officer. After losing both parents at a young age, his father had died years earlier, and his mother was left severely disabled after a car accident. He was described as quiet, isolated, and often bullied. Teachers recalled a teenager who rarely spoke unless spoken to, someone who seemed to exist on the edges of every room. He spent long hours online, posting dark messages and sketches that hinted at despair and detachment. Still, there was no formal intervention. On the reservation, resources for mental health and school safety were already stretched thin. On the 21st of March 2005, just after 2:30 p.m., Wise first went to his grandfather's home. What happened there was brief but devastating. His grandfather, the tribal police sergeant he lived with, and his grandfather's partner at the house, both died at the scene. Taking his grandfather's police-issued firearm, ammunition, and vehicle, Wise drove to Red Lake High School. He arrived at the school entrance and shot the unarmed security guard standing at the door. Then he entered the building, moving through the halls and into a classroom. Students later described panicked desks overturning, windows shattering, and alarms blaring as people ran or hid. In just a few minutes, several students and a teacher were fatally wounded, and others were injured. It all ended when tribal police officers rushed inside. Wise turned the weapon on himself as police closed in. In total, 9 people were killed before the incident ended. His grandfather, the woman at the house, a security guard, a teacher, 5 students, and then himself. This was one of the few school tragedies carried out on sovereign tribal land, which immediately caused confusion among agencies. Who was in charge? Tribal police, the FBI, local law enforcement, or federal authorities? The investigation found that warning signs had been present. Wise had written online about violent ideologies, depression, and feeling disconnected from life. Some students claimed they heard rumors days earlier, but no structured threat assessment system existed at the school. The school security officer, though present, was unarmed, and tribal police had no active shooter training at the time. Many officers waited outside initially, unsure whether to breach the building or wait for backup, a hesitation that would later be heavily criticized. Because the crime took place on federal tribal land, the FBI took control of the investigation. They searched Wise's computer, school papers, and journals. The president of the Red Lake Tribal Council said publicly that the tragedy was not only an attack on the school, but also a failure of systems meant to protect Native communities. There was no trial, since Wise died before officers reached him. But what followed changed policy. Tribal schools across the U.S. began receiving federal funding for active shooter drills, threat assessment training, and counseling services. The Bureau of Indian Affairs issued new guidelines requiring armed school security and direct lines of communication between tribal police, the FBI, and local emergency responders. It became the catalyst for modernizing tribal law enforcement tactics, especially in rural and isolated communities. Today, Red Lake High School has a memorial for the victims and a fully trained security team. Tribal police now train alongside state and federal agencies in active shooter response, a change that emerged directly because of what happened that day. From the outside, it looked like another high school tragedy, but for many, it revealed something deeper: the consequences of silence, isolation, and unpreparedness. And it marked the beginning of a new era in how tribal schools and police respond to danger. Next is a case that shocked an entirely different kind of community: a peaceful Amish schoolhouse in Pennsylvania. Number 2. Charles Carl Roberts, Amish schoolhouse shooting. It was supposed to be an ordinary autumn morning in one of the quietest places in America, rural Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The Amish community there lived without electricity, cars, or modern distractions. Yet on the 2nd of October 2006, Violence found them in the most unimaginable way, inside a one-room schoolhouse known as West Nickel Mines. Charles Carl Roberts IV was 32 years old, a milk truck driver and father of three. To outsiders, he appeared calm, responsible, devoted to his family, but privately, he carried heavy emotional burdens and long-standing grief. Years earlier, his first child had died shortly after birth. He confided to his wife that he struggled with guilt, anger, and intrusive thoughts he couldn't control. But he had no criminal history, no police record, and no one believed he was capable of harming anyone. Shortly after 10 a.m., Roberts entered the Amish schoolhouse, carrying a handgun, a shotgun, ammunition, and improvised restraints. He told the teacher and boys to leave. Only female students, girls aged 6 to 13, remained inside. He barricaded the doors using wooden boards and nearby desks. Someone outside called 911, and police arrived within minutes, but they faced a troubling dilemma. This was a hostage situation, and the perpetrator was heavily armed with children in the room. Roberts made brief contact with police but refused to surrender. Negotiators tried to speak with him, but he gave only short, calm responses. Suddenly, without warning, he opened fire on the young hostages. As police forced their way inside, Roberts turned the weapon on himself, ending the violence in seconds. 5 girls died, and 5 others were critically injured but survived. The entire attack lasted less than an hour, but its impact went far beyond that schoolhouse. Because this was a peaceful Amish community that rejected modern law enforcement and had no school security measures, the tragedy drew national attention. Investigators searched Roberts' home and found notes expressing remorse and unresolved pain, but no clear plan beyond that day. There was no criminal trial, as Roberts died at the scene. But the legal conversation shifted to prevention and response. The state of Pennsylvania reviewed its policies for rural school safety, and police departments across the country studied the case as an example of how hostage situations can rapidly become active shooter incidents. This resulted in new training for officers, immediate breach tactics, rapid decision-making, and blended hostage active shooter protocols. Perhaps the most unexpected part of the story came afterward from the Amish themselves. Within days, members of the community visited Roberts' family to offer forgiveness. They attended his funeral. They said anger would only deepen the pain. This response astonished the nation and became a central part of how the story was remembered. In terms of policing, the attack prompted reforms in how rural schools coordinate with law enforcement. Schools, even in remote or religious communities, were encouraged to adopt silent alert systems, evacuation plans, and trauma counseling resources. It also helped shape modern negotiation strategy, emphasizing faster action when children are in immediate danger. Today, a small memorial stands where the school once stood. The building was torn down and replaced with an open field. The survivors grew older, some speaking about healing, others choosing silence. But law enforcement agencies still study the case not for its brutality, but for the lessons it taught about speed, communication, and compassion in the aftermath. Next is a university tragedy that forced colleges across America to rethink how fast police notify and respond to campus threats. Number 3. Stephen Kazmierczak, Northern Illinois University shooting. On the 14th of February, 2008, students filled Cole Hall at Northern Illinois University, expecting a normal afternoon lecture. Some were thinking about upcoming exams or weekend plans. No one imagined that within minutes, their campus would become the center of a national conversation about police response time and emergency alerts in universities. Stephen Kazmierczak was 27 years old. He had once been an honor student at NIU, majoring in sociology. Professors described him as intelligent, soft-spoken, and polite. He even won an award for academic excellence just 2 years earlier. But after leaving campus, his life started to unravel. He stopped taking prescribed medication for mental health issues. Friends noticed he became isolated and unpredictable, but no one saw a direct threat coming. Shortly after 3 p.m., Kazmierczak walked onto campus wearing dark clothing and carrying a shotgun and handguns concealed in a guitar case. He entered a large lecture hall filled with students attending an introductory geology class. Without saying a word, he began firing toward the front rows and across the classroom. Panic followed instantly. Students dropped behind seats. Others broke windows to escape. Someone called 911 within seconds. Police were already nearby. After previous school tragedies like Virginia Tech, NIU had trained officers to respond without delay. Within roughly 6 minutes, campus police reached the building. But just as they entered the lecture hall, the gunfire stopped. Kazmierczak had taken his own life at the front of the classroom. 5 students died, and more than a dozen were injured. The investigation revealed that Kazmierczak had legally purchased all his firearms. He had passed background checks, had no criminal record, and no official history that barred him from owning weapons. Police also discovered he mailed a package the morning of the attack to his ex-girlfriend, containing a goodbye letter and personal items. What made this case stand out was not only its impact on the victims, but how it changed campus safety across the United States. The tragedy highlighted a major failing at Virginia Tech the year before students weren't warned until it was too late. At NIU, police and university officials sent out a campus-wide alert within minutes of the first call. Text messages, emails, and website notices were activated quickly, urging students to take shelter or leave the area. Although fast, it still wasn't fast enough to prevent the deaths inside Cole Hall. That led lawmakers to push for mandatory emergency communication systems at all colleges receiving federal funding. Universities began installing panic buttons in classrooms, upgrading door locks, and conducting active shooter drills with campus police and local law enforcement. It helped formalize a system where police no longer waited outside, but entered immediately to stop the threat. There was no trial or sentencing, but the legal and procedural impact was significant. In 2008, Congress reinforced the Clery Act, requiring universities to issue timely warnings during campus emergencies. Schools were also required to develop written emergency plans and conduct regular training. Today, a memorial garden stands next to the rebuilt Cole Hall, honoring the 5 students whose lives were lost: Gail Dubowski, Catalina Garcia, Juliana Gahant, Ryan Mace, and Daniel Parmenter. Their names became symbols of change in how universities protect their students. The NIU shooting is remembered not only for the lives it took, but for the systems it transformed. It forced schools to answer a difficult question: how fast can you warn thousands of people when seconds make the difference between safety and tragedy? Next is a case that didn't happen in a school, but inside a government building where a man walked into a city council meeting and opened fire. Number 4. Charles Cookie Thornton, Kirkwood City Hall shooting. It was a quiet February evening in Kirkwood, Missouri. Inside City Hall, a local council meeting was underway, routine, calm, the kind of public gathering where residents debated zoning, permits, and budgets. But on the 7th of February, 2008, the meeting was interrupted in a way no one could have imagined. A man walked inside with a handgun and opened fire on elected officials, police officers, and city employees. It became one of the first modern attacks on a government building during an active session, and it changed how public offices across America approach security. The shooter was Charles Cookie Thornton, a 52-year-old lifelong resident of Kirkwood. He was once a well-known figure in the community, a construction contractor and former firefighter. But over the years, he developed a tense and hostile relationship with city officials. His company received dozens of citations for building code violations and operating without permits. Thornton attended council meetings regularly, accusing city leaders of targeting him unfairly. He became increasingly disruptive and was escorted out of meetings several times. In 2007, he was even arrested for disorderly conduct during a public session. What seemed like a civil dispute was slowly becoming something darker. On the night of the attack, around 7 p.m., Thornton parked near City Hall and walked inside with 2 handguns and extra ammunition. As he entered the building, he shot and killed a police officer who was on duty in the lobby. He took the officer's weapon, reloaded, and moved into the council chamber. Inside, the meeting was being recorded and live-streamed to local television. Thornton shouted phrases condemning the government before firing at council members and city staff. The mayor, Mike Swoboda, was critically wounded. 2 council members and a public works employee died at the scene. A second officer, who ran in after hearing the gunfire, was shot as he tried to stop the attack. Within moments, more officers entered the chamber. Thornton was confronted and fatally shot before he could move to other rooms in the building. The entire attack lasted just minutes, but it left 6 people dead, including the shooter, and left the town in shock. The investigation confirmed Thornton acted alone. He left behind written documents expressing anger towards city officials and claiming he was treated unfairly. But there was no evidence of broader planning or accomplices. Legally, there was no trial. But the incident forced a serious discussion across the U.S. about security in public government buildings. Many city halls at the time had no metal detectors, no armed guards, and no emergency lockdown procedures. Council meetings were considered safe community spaces open to the public with little resistance at the door. That changed almost immediately. Municipal buildings began installing metal detectors, panic buttons, and employing armed officers during public meetings. Glass barriers, secure entry points, and evacuation drills became standard in many towns and cities. Mayor Swoboda survived the initial attack, but passed away months later due to complications from his injuries. His death further fueled changes in how local governments protect public servants and citizens during meetings. Today, the Kirkwood case is studied not just as a tragedy, but as a turning point. It revealed that even small-town institutions were not immune to targeted violence, and it reshaped how police departments coordinate with local governments to provide on-site security. Next is an attack that targeted immigrants inside a community center where language barriers and delayed communication changed how 911 systems operate nationwide. Number 5. Jiverly Wong, Binghamton Immigration Center shooting. On the 3rd of April, 2009, a quiet morning at the American Civic Association in Binghamton, New York, turned into a national tragedy. This building was a place where immigrants studied English, prepared for citizenship tests, and sought help building a new life. That morning, over 40 people were gathered in classrooms until a man walked in carrying 2 handguns and opened fire. What followed exposed a critical weakness in emergency communication, especially when language barriers stand between victims and first responders. The attacker was 4 one-year-old Jiverly Wong, a Vietnamese immigrant who had lived in the United States for nearly 2 decades. He once worked in manufacturing and as a delivery driver, but in the years before the attack, he became increasingly isolated. Friends said he felt humiliated by job loss, struggled with English despite attending language classes at the same center, and believed people mocked his accent. He legally owned firearms and trained at shooting ranges regularly, but had no serious criminal history. At around 10:30 a.m., Wong parked his car against the building's rear exit, deliberately blocking the door so no one could escape. He then entered the lobby and immediately fired at 2 receptionists. One died, the other pretended to be dead, and quietly called 911. Despite being critically injured, she was the first to alert police. Dozens of students in the classrooms froze, hid in closets, or lay on the ground. Many didn't speak English well, which made calling for help almost impossible. Police arrived within minutes, but here was the critical failure. Officers believed the situation was still active and that Wong might be holding hostages. They hesitated to storm the building without clear information or communication from inside. SWAT teams surrounded the building while negotiators attempted to make contact. But inside, Wong had already taken his own life. For 40 minutes, no one entered. Wounded victims remained untreated because police did not know if the shooter was still alive. By the time officers finally entered, 13 people were dead, including the gunman, and 4 were injured. Investigators later discovered a letter Wong had mailed to a local news station, expressing resentment and hopelessness. He wrote that he felt invisible in the country he thought would give him a better life. Because this tragedy took place inside a multicultural center, most victims were recent immigrants from China, Haiti, Pakistan, Iraq, Brazil, and the Philippines. Many couldn't communicate with 911 or police during the attack. Some stayed hidden for hours after police arrived because they didn't understand English commands being shouted by SWAT teams. The aftermath led to major reforms. Emergency dispatch centers across the U.S. were required to develop better access to live translation services. Police departments updated active shooter protocol. If shots are no longer heard, officers must still enter quickly to prevent more deaths. The delay at Binghamton became a cautionary example of how waiting too long can cost lives. There was no trial, but the legal impact was significant. New York State reviewed procedures for handling multilingual emergencies. The federal government encouraged local agencies to train officers on how to communicate with non-English speakers under extreme stress. The American Civic Association also received funding to rebuild and offer mental health support to survivors. Today, a memorial stands outside the center, listing the names of the 12 victims. The building has new security systems, emergency exits, and relationships with local police for faster response. The shooting at Binghamton wasn't just about violence, it was about silence, voices that couldn't call for help, and officers who hesitated because they didn't know the situation inside. It changed how America thinks about communication in a crisis. Next is a school tragedy in Texas that reshaped how classrooms prepare for danger, where teachers, not just police, were expected to fight back. Number 6. Dimitrios Pagortzis, Santa Fe High School shooting. On the 18th of May 2018, the school day at Santa Fe High School in Texas began like any other. Students moved through the hallways, chatting with friends, unaware that within minutes, their school would become the center of a national debate, not just about violence, but about whether teachers and staff should be armed and how quickly schools should alert police during an attack. The attacker was one 7-year-old Dimitrios Pagortzis, a junior at the school. He wasn't a complete outcast. He played on the school's football team, came from a working-class family, and had no criminal record. But classmates described him as distant, with a quiet, simmering anger. In the weeks before the MS-conded attack, he posted images on social media showing a long coat covered in symbols and a shirt that read, "Born to Kill." Few people took it seriously. At around 7:30 a.m., Pagortzis entered the school armed with a shotgun and a revolver, both legally owned by his parents. He walked into an art classroom and began firing. Students and teachers scrambled to hide behind tables and counters. Some broke windows to escape. Fire alarms were pulled, and students flooded the hallways, not yet realizing the alarm wasn't a drill. Police officers were already nearby. Because of lessons learned from other school tragedies, Santa Fe police and school officers engaged the shooter within 4 minutes. Pagortzis exchanged fire with them and eventually retreated into a classroom storage area, where he stayed for more than 20 minutes before surrendering. 10 people died, 8 students, and 2 teachers, and 13 others were injured. During the investigation, authorities found improvised, explosive devices on campus and in Pagortzis' home, suggesting he had planned the attack for some time. He told police he spared certain students because he liked them and wanted his story heard, not ended. Legally, he was charged with capital murder and aggravated assault against a public servant. Because he was under 18, he was not eligible for the death penalty. Court proceedings were delayed repeatedly after he was found mentally unfit to stand trial. As of now, he remains in a secure mental health facility, with the possibility of trial still pending. This attack set off major changes in Texas school safety. Unlike previous tragedies, police had responded quickly, but even that wasn't fast enough to stop the loss of life. In response, Texas lawmakers introduced the Guardian program, allowing trained teachers and school staff to carry firearms on campus. Schools across the state were required to install panic alert systems, reinforce classroom doors, and conduct regular lockdown drills. The state also mandated that each district create a threat assessment team to identify students showing warning signs. Nationally, the Santa Fe tragedy shifted the question from "how did police respond?" to "should schools defend themselves before police arrive?" It emphasized that rural schools might face longer delays for backup and that communication between staff and law enforcement needed to be instant. Today, the school has been renovated with new fencing, camera systems, and a restructured layout to limit entry points. Families of the victims still push for accountability, not just for the attacker, but for how systems failed to recognize danger before it happened. The Santa Fe High School tragedy left a painful legacy, but it reshaped school security in Texas. It reminded the country that even when officers respond quickly, preparation inside the school can determine whether lives are lost or saved. Next is a case where the victims weren't students or officials, but journalists, an attack inside a newsroom that changed how media offices handle threats and police protection. Number 7. Jared Ramos, Capital Gazette newsroom shooting. On the 28th of June 2018, journalists at the Capital Gazette newspaper in Annapolis, Maryland, were doing what they did every day, editing stories, checking headlines, preparing for deadline. Their office was small, quiet, and open to the public. They didn't have security guards, metal detectors, or panic buttons. That afternoon, a man walked through the front doors with a shotgun. In less than a minute, everything changed, not just for the newsroom, but for how police and media organizations across the country prepare for danger. The attacker was 8-year-old Jared Ramos. Years earlier, the newspaper had published a story about his harassment case. Ramos sued the paper for defamation, but a judge dismissed it, saying all of the information was accurate. From that point on, Ramos became fixated on the newspaper and its staff. He sent angry emails, posted threats online, and repeatedly complained to courts and police. Yet because he never acted violently, authorities said there was little they could do. On that summer afternoon, Ramos entered the Gazette building just after 2:30 p.m. He had planned the attack carefully. He barricaded the back exit to trap people inside, then stepped into the open newsroom and began firing. Reporters hid under desks, some sending messages to loved ones, others calling 911. Within about 60 seconds of the first shots, the call reached police. This time, unlike older cases such as Binghamton or Columbine, officers didn't wait. Within 2 minutes, they entered the building, moving toward the sound of gunfire. Ramos was found hiding under a desk and surrendered without resistance. 5 employees of the newspaper died: Gerald Fishman, Rob Hyacinth, John McNamara, Rebecca Smith, and Wendy Winters. The aftermath sparked urgent questions. Why wasn't the newspaper protected, even after years of documented threats? Journalists said they had felt vulnerable for a long time, but most newsrooms in America had little to no physical security. Investigators found that Ramos had spent years planning. He removed his fingerprints to avoid identification and damaged his own weapons to slow ballistic tracing. But he carried no exit plan. His intent was to make a statement, not escape. Ramos was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. In 2021, a jury rejected his insanity defense and found him criminally responsible. He was later sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. This attack forced newsrooms across the country to confront a new reality. Journalists were now potential targets. Security protocols changed immediately. Many newspapers installed locked entry doors, panic alarms, bullet-resistant glass, and required visitor check-ins. Police departments updated their active shooter training to include media offices specifically, recognizing them as high-risk sites during public controversy or political tension. The Capital Gazette staff did something remarkable. After the attack, they still published the next day's paper. On the front page, under the masthead, one line read, "Tomorrow this newspaper will publish." It became a symbol of resilience. Today, the building where the attack occurred stands with tighter security, but the desks of the victims remain memorials. The Gazette case didn't just change how newsrooms think about safety, it reminded the world that threats, even when ignored or dismissed, can grow into violence. Next is a case from Florida, where a quiet yoga studio became the scene of a targeted attack and exposed failures in identifying warning signs of violent ideology. Number 8. Scott Byral, Tallahassee hot yoga studio shooting. On the 2nd of November 2018, A peaceful yoga class was underway on the second floor of a small studio in Tallahassee, Florida. Soft music played, lights were dimmed, and people were stretching in silence. Then, without warning, a man walked in, armed with a handgun. What happened next lasted only a few minutes, but it forced law enforcement to confront a new kind of threat, one driven by resentment, ideology, and warning signs that were seen but never acted upon. The attacker was 40-year-old Scott Paul Byerl. He had a history of disturbing behavior, including harassment complaints and past arrests for inappropriate conduct, but none of those incidents resulted in serious charges or jail time. On social media, he posted videos filled with anger toward women and admiration for previous attackers who shared similar views. He was part of an emerging online subculture where frustration and extremism blended into violent fantasies. Yet at the time, this ideology wasn't widely recognized by law enforcement. At around 5:30 p.m., Byerl entered Hot Yoga Tallahassee, pretending to be a customer. Moments later, he pulled out a handgun and opened fire on the people inside the studio. Some tried to run, others fought back. One man rushed him and was shot while trying to disarm him. Within minutes, police received multiple emergency calls. Officers arriving at the scene heard the last gunshot Byerl had taken his own life before they entered. 2 women died, and several others were injured. The victims included a college student and a medical school researcher. There was no trial, no interrogation, but investigators soon uncovered YouTube videos and online writings where Byerl showed his beliefs clearly. He blamed women for his personal failures, praised past attackers, and suggested violence was justified. This case became a turning point for threat assessment in America. Unlike previous shootings motivated by revenge or personal disputes, this one was ideological. It pushed police and federal agencies to recognize and track patterns of violence associated with misogyny and extremist online communities. Law enforcement began labeling this category as gender-based violence extremism. There were additional failures, too. Byerl had been reported multiple times for alarming behavior, including grabbing women in public. Yet because charges were often dropped and he was never convicted of a serious crime, he legally owned firearms. This inspired new conversations about red flag laws, measures that allow police to temporarily remove weapons from individuals who show violent warning signs. Florida introduced more robust threat assessment teams in universities and workplaces, requiring them to coordinate directly with police if someone showed escalating behavior. Yoga studios, fitness centers, churches, and other open community spaces began practicing active threat drills, something unimaginable before. The survivors later spoke publicly about the bravery inside that room. Some played dead, others helped classmates escape through side doors. One woman used her body to shield a friend. In the days after, the studio filled with flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. It became clear that this tragedy was not only about one individual, but about a system that had seen the signs and still failed to act. Today, the yoga studio has reopened with enhanced security, and Florida law enforcement agencies use the Tallahassee case in training seminars focused on early intervention, ideology-driven violence, and how silence can turn dangerous. Next is an attack inside a government office in 2019, where a longtime employee suddenly turned on his coworkers, forcing new rules on security inside municipal buildings. Number 9. Dwayne Craddock, Virginia Beach Municipal Building. Shooting the 31st of May 2019 began like any other workday at the Virginia Beach Municipal Center in Virginia. Employees from public utilities, planning, and city administration went about their routines, but by the end of the afternoon, the building would become one of the deadliest municipal office crime scenes in U.S. history, prompting cities across the country to rethink how government workplaces are protected. The attacker was 40-year-old Dwayne Craddock, a certified engineer who had worked for the city's public utilities department for nearly 15 years. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and was described by colleagues as quiet but polite. However, in the weeks before the attack, Craddock submitted his resignation. Some co-workers noticed he seemed withdrawn and uneasy. What no one knew was that he had already begun planning the assault. At around 4 p.m., inside Building 2 of the Municipal Center, Craddock used his employee keycard to access secure areas as staff were wrapping up their workday. He carried 2 legally purchased handguns with extended magazines and a suppressor. Without warning, he began firing in office hallways and inside workspaces. Employees frantically called 911, barricaded doors, or hid inside closets. Police received the first emergency call within minutes. Officers were already nearby and entered the building rapidly, following modern active shooter protocol. But the structure of the building, multiple hallways, closed rooms, and keycard-only sections made locating the attacker extremely difficult. Gunfire echoed across floors, and visibility was low. Craddock moved through the building, firing at anyone he encountered. After nearly 36 minutes, police found him on the second floor. A gunfight broke out between Craddock and officers. He was critically injured in the exchange and later died at the hospital. 12 people were killed and 4 others were injured. All victims were city employees or contractors who worked in the building. The investigation revealed that Craddock had purchased firearms legally. He had no documented threats, no direct warnings to law enforcement, and no clear manifesto. This made it one of the most challenging types of cases violence coming from a trusted insider. With no trial possible, focus shifted to prevention. Local and federal agencies studied how a secured municipal building with police-trained staff could still be so vulnerable. The attack led to immediate changes. Metal detectors and armed security were added to government buildings across multiple states. Employee keycard access systems were redesigned so police could override locked doors during emergencies. Panic buttons and silent alarm apps were placed on office computers and staff phones. Cities implemented threat assessment programs to identify employees showing signs of severe stress or instability. Victims' families criticized the city for outdated floor plans and a lack of internal communication during the attack. In response, Virginia passed legislation requiring government offices to create emergency response plans, perform active threat drills, and ensure real-time coordination between building security and police dispatch. A memorial now stands outside the building, engraved with the names of the 12 people who lost their lives. City officials vowed to never return operations to the exact same rooms where the tragedy happened, out of respect for the victims. What made this case especially alarming was how ordinary everything seemed before it began. No manifesto, no public threats, just a longtime employee who one day walked into work and never left. It showed police that even secure workplaces can become targets from within, and that preparation must go beyond exterior threats. Next is the final case. Number 10. Samuel Cassidy, San Jose VTA rail yard, shooting the 26th of May, 2021, began like any ordinary morning at the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority rail yard in San Jose, California. Mechanics, controllers, and engineers arrived before sunrise, preparing trains for daily service. But just after 6:30 a.m., the workplace turned into the scene of a tragedy that revealed how unprepared law enforcement agencies were when raiders came to coordinating with each other during an active threat. The attacker was 57-year-old Samuel Cassidy, a maintenance technician who had worked at VTA for nearly 20 years. He was known for being quiet, easily irritated, and often isolating himself from coworkers. Some said he held on to grudges for years, but he never made a threat that resulted in serious disciplinary action. Unknown to those around him, he had also been collecting firearms and ammunition at home. That morning, Cassidy set his own house on fire, then drove to the rail yard while the fire spread behind him. He used his employee badge to enter secure areas of the facility, carrying handguns and multiple loaded magazines. Without any warning, he began shooting his coworkers in 2 different buildings. Some victims were targeted at close range, others were caught while trying to escape. Chaos spread instantly through the workplace. People hid under desks, locked themselves in rooms, or called loved ones in their phones. Police officers from several departments arrived within minutes. But because the attack took place in a government facility with restricted access, some officers couldn't immediately enter certain buildings without security cards. Different agencies were using separate radio channels, meaning not everyone on scene could communicate clearly. By the time officers moved deeper inside the facility, Cassidy had already taken his own life. 9 VTA employees were killed. The investigation found that Cassidy had legally purchased his weapons. In his burned home, authorities discovered ammunition, paperwork showing financial frustration, and notes expressing anger towards coworkers. There was no criminal trial, no confession in a courtroom, only his actions and the questions they left behind. What followed was a major shift in how cities across the U.S. prepared for violence in municipal workplaces. Officials realized that even when police arrive quickly, confusion between agencies can cost lives. In response, law enforcement in Santa Clara County began operating on shared emergency radio systems. Building floor plans for critical facilities were digitized and given to police and fire departments so officers could navigate faster during a crisis. Municipal buildings started using upgraded badge systems that allowed police to override locked doors during emergencies. Some cities required employees to take active threat training, and workplaces began forming behavioral threat assessment teams to report concerning behavior before it evolved into violence. Families of the victims pressed lawmakers for change, arguing that people should not feel unsafe going to work in a government building. California legislators answered by passing new workplace safety standards and requiring emergency response plans in state-run offices. A permanent memorial now stands outside the rail yard, honoring the employees whose lives were lost. The buildings remain in use, but the culture around safety there has changed forever. The San Jose VTA tragedy became a reminder that danger does not always come from outside a secure facility. Sometimes it walks in with a badge, unnoticed, until it's too late. And with that, this marks the final case, 10 moments in modern history where failure led to change, where law enforcement realized that the systems meant to protect communities were not built for the world we live in now.